Our third presenter is Professor Feng Wang. He's professor of sociology at the University of California, Irvine, and also professor of sociology and demography at Fudan University in China. He has a wide-ranging program of research activities, including demography. And so I'm not sure I have the correct title for your talk, but the one that's in the program
That's good enough.
Which is implications of China's demographic profile. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. So this is on, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I do the things that demographers don't normally do, that is to make comments without graphs, PowerPoint. Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here. As I told the organizer last night at dinner, the program is really nicely waved together with beginning with economic growth and then putting demography population into this, and with a lot of comparisons with Japan, which I'll come to as in a while as well. I think, excuse me, I think in the future, when future generations look back at the 30 or 40 years of spectacular economic growth, they're going to realize that this historical period was heavily mortgaged on many things. It came with heavy costs. Among them, social inequality. We talked about, I think, Kathy Harris and also Professor Jessel. And also environment, right? I flew from Shanghai 2 days ago. The air quality there was pretty bad. And the week before that in Beijing was equally bad. And of all the costs or the mortgages that China put 35 or 40 years ago when the reform began, was the one on population. I say so because I think not many people paid attention that the real fertility decline in China did not take place after the one-child policy was launched, but it was before the one-child policy was implemented. And in the 1970s, fertility measured by the number of children a woman would have in her life dropped from close to 6 to barely below 2.5. And then China still want to have a one-child policy, and for which we all know it's going to have tremendous costs, which I would mention also later on briefly. So China, in a way, I would say it does not look like a kind of normal country. The country is still run, even today, on a campaign mode. It's always in the organization, in a new movement, with a new goal, and with a new future. The idea is that I think what we're looking now is that future is now. So 30, 40 years ago, when the one-child policy was implemented, the leader said, okay, in 30 to 30-some years from now, China will be much better. So we would be able to address all the negative consequences of this policy by then. Now, this is, well, the future is here, right? So I would like to do two things. One is to highlight a few features of so-called the demographic profile. What's really going on in China with the demography? And then the second part is to comment briefly, as the title suggests, on some of the implications, right? And the implications are really for, I think, for the people here on the table to discuss. Now, how do we characterize the Chinese demographic profile? As I think one of the panelists said early on, size is no longer the matter, because within less than 10 years, China will no longer be the largest population in the world, right? So what really matters is looking at what's going on within the population, the age structure, the structure of education, and other aspects. Now, there are three positive things we have to recognize with the new Chinese demographic profile. The first one is, even with great inequality, it is a relatively wealthy and beyond poverty population. China has reached the high middle income status with a tremendous inequality. Survival for most people, subsistence, is beyond the question. So a lot of people can talk about the middle class, who is the middle class, how do we define the middle class, but by and large, China is a middle income society or upper middle income society, and that is a fact. And that's a very important baseline. And we can talk about how China is still not rich enough, but that's the number one baseline. Number two, the population is a lot healthier, and it is getting healthier all the time. So there were a lot of concerns 20 years ago, in the early 1990s, the fear of the collapse of the social health care, especially in rural areas. But census after census, survey after survey, what we've shown is China has achieved very low infant mortality, very low maternal mortality, and continued increase in life expectancy. So that is also a very important baseline. And now the third, I would say the brighter spot, again with a small undernote, Professor Prasan is going to discuss this in the afternoon, is the increase in education. Most people who go to China these days would recognize the new airports, these bullet trains, and the new roads. But China has also invested enormously in expanding educational facilities. So at lower level of education, we're talking about basic saturation of primary education, universal primary education, very high enrollment ratio for junior high, and somewhat to senior high. But what's most remarkable is within 10 years, China increased its capacity of university enrollment by 7-fold, from 1 million to 7 million. What this means is that even without further expansion, half of Chinese births in the future would be able to go to college. Right? That is done within 1 decade. So that is quite remarkable. So these are healthier, richer, and more educated population should lay a foundation for what I think the first panel discussed is the future increase in productivity. Now, there are a lot of issues involved here with quality, with inequality, and those issues I think will be addressed later on in the afternoon. So these are some of the brightest spots when we look at this. Now there are vulnerabilities, and I think people generally focus on those, right? The first one is a very rapid process of population aging. I think what's going on there is it's not only the aging is accelerating at a massive speed with huge numbers. We're looking at the number of population aged 60 and over, more or less doubling within the next 15 years, from slightly over 200 million now to over 400 million. That's going to be larger than the United States population, and we're looking at more than 1/5 of the population will be aged 65 and over, and age 60 and over. So that speed and also the number are both, I think, both are massive. So that is one feature people have talked about. And I think what's important to notice that is the aging trend is here to stay. The reason is the fertility in China in the last 20 years has been very low. The latest number that came out of the 2015 population sample survey, I think it's 1% of the Chinese population, gave a fertility number, total fertility number, that's number of children per woman, or woman would have, of something like 1.1. That's the lowest, among the lowest in the world. Even if you gave it 30% undercount, that's 1.3, 1.4, that's still lower, not much higher than Japan, among the lowest. And there are always a lot of questions about the Chinese statistics, including demographics. But one thing we know that is really driving this, I think would have significance for the economy, is how young people are postponing their marriage. Back in 2010, back in 2000, about 10% of women aged 25 to 29 were single. By the 2010 census, that share doubled within 10 years. right? And so when when young women in their late 20s, early 30s worry about whether they have become what's called the leftover women, I will tell them in urban China, back in 2010, this is 2016 now, 1 in 3 aged 30 was still single. So that trend actually follows South Korea and then Japan. Now in Japan, the share of unmarried women at age 35 to 39 is about 20%. And in South Korea, it's 30 to 34. And in China, it's 25, 29. So you can see how this is moving in that direction, right? And so with later marriage, with the massive migration and then increasing education and increased uncertainties in the job market and the high cost of living. So a lot of these forces are driving the Chinese marriages and driving the Chinese low fertility. So in other words, what we're seeing right now will continue to be the case. That's in terms of population aging. So I'll come back to aging in a while. And then the second vulnerability is somewhat quite unique, and that's in part associated with the one-child policy. That is a very large share of Chinese families will have only one child. Currently, we have about 1 in 3 of all Chinese households with only one child. Okay. We're looking at, that's 150 million households, right? And so that would have tremendous implications, I think, for demand, for aging support. We talked about this somewhat last night at dinner. So that is a vulnerability that not other societies would share. I mean, in every society you have people without children or with only one child, but it's only in China where you would have a large share of the population that would end up with only one child. Okay. And a lot of this is really not voluntary. The third vulnerability is it's the primitiveness and also the fragmented social safety net system that China has established, right? To give the credit to the Chinese policymakers, the government in the first decade of the 21st century, with the abundance of government revenue, the government extended or established a comprehensive set of social safety measures from education. I mean, education is really social welfare, not social safety net, but from healthcare to pension. But the system is highly fragmented. We don't have time to go into the details. And for a lot of people, the support level is very, very low. Okay. I saw a report this morning, I'm not sure whether the numbers are correct, basically saying that, this is from Caijing magazine in China, that in the United States, the second and third pillar of the pension, of the elderly support, other than Social Security, accounted for about 150% of the US GDP. And in China, that number is personal individual account and also savings account for pension, not the Social Security part. In China, the number was 3% right now of the GDP. So these are some of the vulnerabilities. So what are the implications? There are two sets of implications. One is for the economy. Actually, I think the literature in that regard is not conclusive. The latest National Academy study report of the US National Academy basically concluded that moderate aging does not have a noticeable effect on the economic growth. But what effect it would have is on government spending, right? That's very clear. So I want to talk about both. Now for the economy, again, this is not quite clear, comprehensive, but what we know is that there's a lot of discussion. I think Long Mei talked about the 3 different scenarios of China's economic growth. The rosiest is from Justin Ling, 1 minute, right? Yeah. Okay. From Justin Ling, basically saying that, well, if Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, when they reach the the middle income level, they all continued with 20 more years of 7–8% growth. And the implication I want to point out is that when you look at Japan, when you look at Taiwan, and when you look at South Korea, when they reached the middle income level as defined in this particular study, their aging level is about 4%. It's after their 20 years of marching toward beyond middle income, they reached the aging level of what China has now. Now, we can, given the time constraint, I won't go into too much of this, we can think about what implications in terms of savings, in terms of social spending, and also in terms of support ratio, labor force, that the current aging level China has would have on its economy. Now, let me make one last comment on government spending. Again, this is something we talked about yesterday, and also related to the first panel. That is this opium of growth in China. When the economy was growing at 10% per year in the first decade of 2000, the government was taking in 20%. The government not taking in 20%. The growth rate of government revenue was 20% per year. In the last 3 years, when the economic growth dropped from 10 to 7%, the government revenue increase rate dropped from 20 to less than 10%. So it's a much, much steeper drop. And then when you think about the healthcare costs, when you think about the pension, when you think about the continued need to drive this economy with investment, aging has serious implications. Thank you very much.